The 50 caliber machine gun, mounted on the abandoned tank destroyer, had been silent for 2 days. Its barrel pointed toward the Vosges Mountains like a steel finger accusing the winter sky. Staff Sergeant Audie Murphy had walked past it 3 times during his shifts between the farmhouse and the communications trench, each time noting how the weapon's traverse still worked smoothly, despite the shrapnel scoring across the vehicle's armor plating. The destroyer had taken a direct hit from a Panzerfaust on Tuesday, killing its crew and leaving it stranded beside the barn like a monument to the kind of luck that ran out when you needed it most. Now, crouched behind the kitchen table he'd dragged against the farmhouse window, Murphy found himself calculating angles and fields of fire toward that silent gun. The mathematics were simple enough. 30 meters of open ground between his current position and the destroyer's rear deck, with German positions in the tree line offering overlapping coverage of every step in between. It was the sort of tactical problem that training manuals solved, with covering fire and coordinated movement, except Murphy's squad had 7 men left, maybe 40 rounds per rifle, and no word from battalion since yesterday's failed radio check. Private Henderson shifted nervously beside the back door, his breath forming small clouds in the frozen air as he whispered questions about withdrawal routes and fallback positions. Corporal Kemp, nursing his wounded arm in a makeshift sling, kept pointing to the map spread across the floor and explaining why they couldn't abandon this particular road junction without compromising the entire company's left flank. Murphy listened to both men while watching the woods through his rifle sights, but his attention kept drifting back to that machine gun and the way morning light reflected off its steel housing. The first German probe had come an hour before dawn, just enough muzzle flashes from the forest edge to confirm what they'd all suspected since digging in here. An entire patrol, maybe reinforced squad strength, had been moving through the snow all night, using the rolling farmland and stone walls to establish positions on 3 sides of the American strongpoint. Standard tactics for reducing an isolated position. Surround it, probe for weak spots, then apply steady pressure until something broke. Henderson's voice cut through the cold air with barely controlled panic. "Sarge, maybe we should consider pulling back to the main line. Nobody's gonna fault us for—" Murphy's response came without taking his eyes off the tree line. "Nobody moves until I say, we hold here." But even as he spoke, Murphy could feel the weight of command settling across his shoulders like wet wool. 7 men, counting himself, maybe an hour's worth of ammunition if they were careful. And somewhere in those woods, patient enemies who understood that time favored the side with more bullets and warmer clothing. The radio crackled with distant voices, speaking in frequencies that seemed to belong to another war entirely, coordinates and unit designations that had nothing to do with this frozen farmhouse or the machine gun that sat waiting beside the barn, like an answer to a question nobody wanted to ask. The shot that shattered the kitchen window came from the barn, not the woods, and Murphy realized the Germans had been even busier during the night than he'd calculated. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. Glass fragments scattered across Murphy's shoulders as the second rifle shot punched through the window frame, wood splinters erupting inches from his head. The Germans weren't just probing anymore. They were announcing the beginning of something more deliberate. Through the shattered window, Murphy could see movement in the outbuildings, brief glimpses of field-grey uniforms positioning themselves with the methodical precision of soldiers who'd done this before. "Contact left! Barn and silo!" Murphy's voice carried across the farmhouse as he shifted his aim toward the new threat. The tactical situation had just become considerably worse. Instead of facing pressure from the tree line alone, they now had German marksmen established in elevated positions with clean sightlines to every window and doorway. Corporal Kemp crawled across the floor toward the eastern window, dragging his wounded arm and muttering calculations under his breath. "They've got us in a crossfire. Barn covers the front approach. Tree lines got our flanks." He paused to check his rifle's action with his good hand. "Classic L-shaped ambush, except we walked into it yesterday and just now figured it out." Murphy nodded, but part of his attention remained fixed on that tank destroyer sitting beside the barn. The vehicle's position gave it commanding views of both the German positions in the woods and the approaches they'd use for a final assault. That .50 caliber could sweep the entire area if someone could reach it and keep it supplied with ammunition. The problem was getting there alive, and staying alive long enough to make a difference. Henderson fired 3 quick shots toward the silo, then ducked back as return fire chewed chunks from the doorframe. "They're moving up on the right side. I count at least 4, maybe 6. The mathematics of small unit combat were brutally simple. Murphy had fought enough actions in the Vosges Mountains to understand how these situations developed. The Germans would establish fire superiority through coordinated volleys, then advance by bounds, while American ammunition dwindled. Once the defenders were down to their last magazines, a final rush would settle the matter in seconds. But the tank destroyer changed those calculations. Its machine gun carried enough firepower to break up an assault, provided someone could reach it and operate it under fire. Murphy had trained on .50 caliber weapons during his time with the 3rd Infantry Division, knew their rate of fire and effective range. More importantly, he knew that desperate situations sometimes called for solutions that looked impossible on paper, but made perfect sense when measured against the alternative. Another volley from the German positions sent bullets cracking through the air above their heads. Murphy could hear Henderson's breathing getting faster, could see the way Kemp kept checking his ammunition count. These men trusted him to find a way out of this, but every conventional option led to the same conclusion. Not enough bullets, too many enemies, and time running against them like water through broken fingers. The radio crackled again with distant chatter from other units, reports of German armor moving through the valleys and American positions under pressure across the entire sector. Murphy listened for any mention of relief columns or reinforcements, but heard only the routine traffic of a division spread too thin across too much ground. Through the bullet-starred window, that machine gun waited beside the barn, like a question mark punctuating the winter landscape. The German assault developed with textbook precision, advancing in short rushes while maintaining steady suppressive fire from the tree line. Murphy watched enemy soldiers move between the outbuildings, counting heads and calculating their approach routes. Too many of them, moving with the confidence of troops who knew they had overwhelming advantages in numbers and ammunition. Private Henderson had taken a bullet through his left shoulder 20 minutes earlier. Nothing fatal, but enough to put him out of the fight. He sat propped against the kitchen wall, applying pressure to the wound, while Corporal Kemp tried to raise battalion on the radio. Static and distant voices filled the air, coordinates and unit designations that seemed to come from different battles entirely. No word about relief columns, no mention of reinforcements heading toward their sector. "They're setting up for a final push," Kemp announced quietly, pointing toward the barn where German soldiers were assembling behind cover. "Maybe 10 minutes before they come at us from 3 sides. Murphy nodded, but his gaze kept returning to the tank destroyer. The vehicle sat 30 meters away, its .50 caliber machine gun offering fields of fire that could sweep the entire German approach. He'd been calculating angles and timing for the past hour, measuring the distance against the ammunition his squad had left. 7 men down to maybe 6 rounds apiece. Not enough for a sustained firefight, but sufficient for one massive burst of covering fire. The idea forming in Murphy's mind violated every principle of small unit leadership he'd learned during his service with the 3rd Infantry Division. Squad leaders stayed with their squads. They directed fire and coordinated movement, but they didn't sprint across open ground toward abandoned vehicles, while enemy marksmen held overlapping fields of fire. It was exactly the sort of individual heroics that got good sergeants killed and left their men without leadership. But conventional tactics assumed conventional situations, and nothing about this frozen farmhouse felt conventional anymore. Henderson's voice broke through his calculations, weak but steady. "Sarge, what if we put out a white flag? These look like regular Wehrmacht, not SS. Maybe they'll—" "No surrender." Murphy's response came automatically, but he softened it with something approaching explanation. "Too many reports of prisoners getting shot after they gave up. Besides, we hold this junction, or the whole left flank comes apart." Through the window, he could see German soldiers moving with increasing boldness, establishing final assault positions. They knew the Americans were running low on ammunition, could probably hear the decreasing volume of return fire. Standard procedure called for one overwhelming rush, probably coordinated with covering fire from the barn and tree line. Murphy checked his watch. Year 8, 4-7 hours, full daylight now, with clear sight lines across the frozen farmyard. If he was going to reach that machine gun, it had to be soon, before the Germans finished their preparations. The plan taking shape in his mind was simple enough. Empty every rifle in one sustained burst while he sprinted for the destroyer, then hope the .50 caliber had enough ammunition to break up their assault. Kemp must have sensed his thinking, because the corporal's voice carried a warning tone. "Murphy, whatever you're considering, remember we need you here. Squad falls apart without leadership." But Murphy was already moving toward the window, calculating distances and checking his rifle's action. Sometimes leadership meant staying with your men. Sometimes it meant giving them a chance to see another sunset, even if the mathematics looked impossible. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The decision crystallized in the space between heartbeats. Murphy emptied his M1 rifle in one sustained burst of covering fire, the distinctive crack of American .30-06 rounds mixing with answering volleys from his squad. Then he was moving, vaulting through the shattered window and sprinting across 30 meters of open ground, while German bullets sparked off the frozen earth around his feet. The tank destroyer's rear deck seemed impossibly far away, each stride measured against the increasing accuracy of enemy fire. Murphy could hear Kemp's voice shouting coordinates from the farmhouse, directing what little covering fire his men could provide. Henderson, wounded and propped against the kitchen wall, was firing one-handed through the window, his shots probably wild but adding to the confusion. A Mauser bullet cracked past Murphy's ear as he reached the destroyer's tracks, close enough to feel the displaced air. He hauled himself onto the rear deck while rifle fire sparked against the armor plating, the steel ringing like discordant bells. The .50 caliber machine gun swiveled on its mount, and Murphy's hands found the familiar controls from his training with the 3rd Infantry Division. Bolt back, check the ammunition belt, acquire targets through the iron sights. The machine gun came alive in his hands with a sound like controlled thunder. Heavy bullets swept across the farmyard in long, devastating bursts, chewing through wooden fence posts and sending German soldiers diving for cover. Murphy could feel the weapon's recoil transmitted through the destroyer's frame, could smell cordite and hot metal mixing with the clean scent of winter air in the Vosges Mountains. From his elevated position, the entire tactical situation spread below him like a map drawn in snow and steel. German soldiers who had been advancing confidently moments earlier now scrambled for cover behind stone walls and farm equipment. Murphy traversed the gun methodically, walking bursts of fire across their positions, while his squad provided covering fire from the farmhouse windows. The enemy response came quickly. Rifle fire from multiple positions converged on the tank destroyer, bullets striking armor plate and ricocheting into the morning sky. Murphy felt the heat building in the machine gun's barrel, heard the distinctive whine of rounds passing close enough to part his hair. Someone in the German line was coordinating their fire, probably a sergeant or lieutenant, who understood that eliminating the machine gunner would restore their tactical advantage. But the .50 caliber gave Murphy reach and firepower that individual rifles couldn't match. He could suppress entire positions with sustained bursts, forcing enemy soldiers to keep their heads down while searching for new targets. Through the gun sight, he watched German assault teams hesitate, their careful coordination disrupted by the unexpected volume of fire from what should have been a knocked-out vehicle. Kemp's voice reached him from the farmhouse, calling out enemy positions and movement. "Silo, 2 men moving left to right." Murphy swiveled the gun and sent a long burst through the wooden walls, rewarded by the sight of field grey uniforms retreating toward better cover. The mathematics of the engagement had shifted dramatically. Where German soldiers had enjoyed overwhelming firepower advantages, they now faced concentrated fire from a crew-served weapon with clear fields of observation. Murphy could see their assault formations breaking up, individual soldiers seeking cover instead of maintaining coordinated movement. But ammunition belts had limits, and exposed machine gunners made excellent targets for enemy marksmen. Murphy knew this standoff couldn't last indefinitely. Eventually, German fire discipline would prevail, or they'd bring up heavier weapons, or simple probability would put a rifle bullet where it could do permanent damage. For now, though, the .50 caliber spoke with mechanical precision, each burst carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. The secret that would never appear in any after-action report was how Murphy's hands shook during the first 3 minutes on that machine gun, tremors so violent he could barely control the weapon's traverse. Fear had settled into his bones like winter cold, and every instinct screamed at him to abandon the exposed position and run for cover. Only the sound of his squad's rifles from the farmhouse kept him anchored to the .50 caliber's grips, their trust more binding than any military order. What the citation would later describe as fearless leadership under fire felt from the inside like controlled panic, each burst of the machine gun timed between waves of terror that threatened to freeze his finger on the trigger. Murphy had learned during his months with the 3rd Infantry Division that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the ability to function despite fear that made your vision tunnel and your breath come in ragged gasps. The German soldiers in the tree line were calling to each other now, coordinating their fire with the disciplined professionalism of veterans. Murphy could hear fragments of commands carried on the winter air, officers redirecting their men toward better positions. They were adapting to his presence on the machine gun, probably organizing a flanking movement or calling for mortar support. Through the gun sight, Murphy watched a German sergeant gesture toward the tank destroyer while explaining something to his squad. Even at this distance, he could see the man's methodical approach to solving tactical problems, exactly the sort of enemy leadership that made these mountain battles so costly for both sides. These weren't the broken remnants of a defeated army. They were disciplined soldiers, fighting for ground they understood better than the Americans attacking it. But the .50 caliber had advantages that individual training couldn't overcome. Murphy traversed the weapon toward the sergeant's position and sent a long burst through the pine trees, watching needles and branches cascade down like green snow. The German fell back, his squad scattering toward deeper cover, their coordination temporarily disrupted. Kemp's voice reached him again from the farmhouse. "Murphy! Movement on your right flank! They're trying to get around behind you!" Murphy swiveled the gun and caught sight of field grey uniforms working their way between farm buildings, using stone walls and equipment sheds for cover. Smart tactics. If they could establish positions behind the tank destroyer, they'd have clear shots at his back while he engaged targets to his front. The machine gun's next burst caught them in the open, heavy bullets striking stone and sending chips flying like shrapnel. Murphy saw one German soldier stumble and fall behind a hay cart. Couldn't tell if he was hit or just seeking better cover. Either way, The flanking movement had stalled. What haunted Murphy even during the action was the knowledge that his elevated position made him visible to enemy observers across the entire valley. Every German unit within rifle range could see the lone American on the disabled tank destroyer, could probably coordinate their fire to eliminate him whenever they chose. He was buying time for his squad, but paying for those minutes with exposure that no sane person would accept voluntarily. The mathematical reality remained unchanged. 7 Americans with limited ammunition against a reinforced German patrol with time and numbers on their side. Murphy's position on the machine gun had disrupted their assault timeline, but couldn't eliminate the fundamental imbalance. Eventually, enemy fire discipline would prevail, or they'd bring up support weapons, or simple ammunition shortage would silence the .50 caliber. What kept him anchored to the weapon was the sound of his men's voices from the farmhouse, calling out targets and providing what covering fire they could manage. Henderson, wounded and pale, still firing one-handed through the kitchen window. Kemp directing the squad's movement with calm professionalism despite his injured arm. They were depending on him to hold this position, and Murphy had learned that trust like that created its own form of courage. The end came with unexpected suddenness, the way most firefights concluded in the Vosges Mountains. One moment the air was filled with rifle fire and shouted commands. The next there was only silence drifting across snow-covered ground where German positions had been active minutes earlier. Murphy stayed on the machine gun for another 10 minutes, scanning for movement through iron sights, before Corporal Kemp's voice reached him from the farmhouse. "Murphy, they're pulling back. I can see them moving through the tree line, heading north toward the ridge line." The .50 caliber had finally grown quiet, its barrel too hot to touch, and ammunition belt nearly exhausted. Murphy's hands trembled as he released the gun's grips, adrenaline and exhaustion making his fingers feel disconnected from conscious control. From his position on the tank destroyer, he could see the tactical situation spread below him, like an equation finally solved. German withdrawal routes marked by footprints in snow, abandoned equipment scattered around stone walls where assault teams had taken cover. When the relief column arrived 2 hours later, led by a lieutenant from battalion who looked impossibly young and clean, Murphy was sitting beside the farmhouse, checking his rifle's action. The officer walked directly to the tank destroyer, examining bullet holes in its armor plating and counting empty brass casings scattered around the machine gun mount. His questions came with the mechanical precision of someone preparing an after-action report. "Sergeant Murphy, how long did you maintain that position under fire?" "Maybe 20 minutes, sir. Hard to tell exactly." "Estimate of enemy strength engaged?" "Reinforced squad. Possibly platoon strength." They knew what they were doing. But the lieutenant's follow-up questions missed what Murphy would remember decades later. The weight of the machine gun in hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The faces of his men when they thought they wouldn't see another sunset. The particular quality of silence that followed combat, when your ears were still ringing, but your heart was trying to remember how to beat normally. Henderson survived his shoulder wound and rotated home 6 weeks later, carrying with him stories about Murphy's action that would grow in the telling. Kemp received his Purple Heart and a field promotion, eventually commanding his own squad through the final push into Germany. Both men would spend years trying to explain to civilians what it felt like to watch one soldier sprint across open ground toward a machine gun that might save them all. The official citation reduced 20 minutes of terror and determination to clean, measured prose about conspicuous gallantry in action against an armed enemy. Murphy read it once when the paperwork caught up with him near war's end, then folded it carefully and put it away. The words captured what happened, but missed entirely what it felt like to happen. 40 years later, the smell of diesel fuel and winter air could still transport Murphy back to that tank destroyer, hands gripping a .50 caliber machine gun while German rifles sought his range. Not the heroic version that appeared in newspapers and citation ceremonies, but the private memory of a young man who discovered that endurance isn't about avoiding fear. Sometimes it's about fighting through the whole morning anyway, one burst at a time, until your squad makes it home. They'd said during training that he tired too fast, that he didn't have the stamina for sustained action. But here, in this frozen farmyard, with empty brass casings scattered around the tank destroyer and smoke still rising from German positions in the woods, Murphy proved that courage isn't measured in miles covered or hours endured. Sometimes it's measured in 30 meters of open ground crossed under fire and 20 minutes on a machine gun that bought 7 men another day. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.